So I've been coming to UKFIET as a participant and a presenter, and last time I was here with the Girls' Education Challenge team sharing 12 years of learning and evidence. And I love this space. It's where research and implementation come together, are interrogated, discussed and shared. So it feels like home for many of us here. For me, it's about the passion, though, that everyone holds for what they do, the ethos of this event, the space we kind of collectively create, and the great minds that in the room sharing knowledge and thinking that challenge us to do better, to do more. And we all come from really varied backgrounds. Myself, I started out as a secondary school teacher, and my interest was always about how to support young people to navigate the system as it is, and coming out the other side to adulthood. I mean, this took many forms in finding out who was excluded, who wasn't there, helping those people remain in the system who are struggling, and understanding how to support young people to move from one learning point to another. And that's formed the backdrop of everything that I do. I think this is also reflected in how I see UKFIET. How do we, as academics, practitioners, governments and donors, support our education systems to enable young people to navigate into adulthood successfully and happily? But we come together at a moment when the world feels really unsettled. From climate breakdown and conflict to economic pressures and shifting development priorities, the challenges that are facing us are shaping the way we live and work. Yet it's precisely in these moments that the value of education becomes most clear. It's not a luxury, it's a lifeline, and it's one of the most powerful tools we have to create sustainable, inclusive, and just futures. So our theme this year of mobilising knowledge, partnerships, and innovations for sustainable development through education and training could not be timelier. It calls on us to go beyond mere reflection, to act with courage, and to work differently. To mobilise knowledge is to bridge research and lived experience. And I think ensuring that evidence is not locked away, but actively connected to the realities of learners, teachers, and policymakers. To mobilise partnerships is to remind ourselves that true change comes when relationships are built on respect, equity, solidarity across countries, disciplines, and communities. And we're going to hear about that a lot these next few days. And to mobilise innovation is to refuse to settle for the status quo, and instead to imagine education systems as they might be, flexible, inclusive, and resilient in the face of future shocks. We all have our part to play in that. And across the conference, these ideas will come to life through our sub-themes, from rethinking skills for sustainable futures to deepening inclusion and intersectionality, from strengthening systems to ensuring learner safety and well-being. These aren't abstract discussions. They're anchored in an urgent questions of justice, responsibility, and transformation. They ask us to consider how education can not only respond to today's crises, but also actively reshape the world we want to build. So these thought-provoking symposia, engaging presentations, quick fires, creative sessions, they should really challenge us to think about the so what of what we do and how we work. And I really hope that these next 3 days are going to be precisely that. This conference has also been a place where theory, policy and practice intersect, where researchers, practitioners and policymakers challenge and inspire one another. So the spirit of collaboration that UKFIET nurtures has never been more vital than it is today. Over the next 3 days, we're going to see bold innovations not just showcased, but interrogated. We're going to hear from diverse voices who will be challenged to think about what partnerships are, not as one-way transfers of knowledge, but as spaces of mutual learning and transformation. Above all, I think it's about hope. We hope that together we can utilise our knowledge, relationships and creativity to develop education systems that truly serve as engines for equity, resilience and sustainability. I hope that the conversations and connections you make here in Oxford will endure well beyond this week, shaping not only your research agendas, but also policy choices, community practices, and lives of learners across the globe. So, let's approach these days with openness and energy and with courage. The challenges we face are real, but so too is the determination, the creativity, and the wisdom gathered in these rooms over the next few days from all of you. So on behalf of the organising team and the Executive Committee, thank you for being here, for the work that you do and choosing to be part of this movement. So welcome to UKFIET 2025. Let's make these days count. Thank you. So we've had a last minute change. I'm going to introduce the keynote speakers we have. Our first one, Dr. Ahmed Junina, we thought couldn't come. He's based in Gaza, and I was talking to him last night about whether he would be able to make it live streamed or not. We thought he wouldn't be able to, and now I have a note saying he is online, so I'm very pleased. So I'm going to move really quickly. It's a real pleasure to have him online. So while that's being sorted out, I'll let you know what's happening in this opening plenary. So we have Dr. Maya Chaksliani, who's the chair of the UKFIET Executive Committee, and she will be chairing the rest of this session. And we're going to start with Ahmed in a moment. He's a professor of applied linguistics and head of English department at the Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. He's a fellow at the Bristol University Centre for Comparative and International Research in Education, and the University of, and then we're going to hear from, Dr. Yusuf, who's Professor of Education, University of Cambridge. Hi, Ahmed. Thank you so much for...
Hi, Emma. Hi, everyone. Good morning.
The floor is yours. I've introduced you, so please do give us your keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma, and good morning, colleagues and friends. It is a real privilege and honor to speak at UKFIET and talk to you this morning. As Emma said, it's a last-minute change. And I really apologize, Emma, for the hassle I caused. I was planning to send a pre-record just in case I couldn't connect to the internet. And as Emma said, last-minute changes happened, and I have managed to connect to the internet, and I wanted to talk to you live. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. So I want to begin by saying it is really deeply meaningful for me to bring the voice of Gaza and Gaza academics into UKFIET, into this important space. And if you don't mind, I would like to share my screen. If you open Google Images, just like what I did here, and type higher education or education, what do you see? Most likely, as you can see, modern campuses, gleaming glass buildings, green spaces, air-conditioned lectures or lecture halls, smiling students tossing their graduation caps. I mean, this is the global imagination of higher education. It is safe, well-resourced, and predictable. Now, if you change your search a bit and write education in Gaza or higher education in Gaza, the images are shattering. Bombed out lecture halls, students clutching books and rubble, tents turned into classrooms, faculty teaching under the open sky, and grieving families of students who never made it to graduation. And it doesn't stop there. Archives, libraries, museums, these are the very places that hold Palestinian memory, knowledge, and culture. These have also been destroyed. So what is lost in here is not only the present, but also the threads that connect generations. So the contrast is here really stark, really big. I speak to you today as an educator and head of the English department at Al-Aqsa University here in Gaza. For the past year and a half, I have led and supported an academic community of about 4,500 students and 20 teaching staff under really harsh conditions of siege and bombardment, where universities have been bombed, students displaced, and faculty struggle simply to survive, let alone teach. A few weeks ago, while I was conducting an interview with a colleague about the challenges he faced as an academic teaching during wartime in Gaza, he shared a story that still haunts me. One of his students was unable to attend his final exam. And when my colleague called to check on him, the family delivered the devastating news that the student had been killed in the bombing. I think there is no manual, no guideline, no policy that prepares you as an academic, as an educator for this. These are moments when the ordinary rules of teaching, assessment, and administration simply do not apply. All that remains here is to respond with humanity, understanding, and flexibility. But even that feels painfully inadequate in the face of such loss. In Gaza today, all 12 universities have been bombed. Some partially, others completely. And among them is my own university, Al-Aqsa University, my workplace, the place I call my second home. And for me personally, this has meant that my office, my classrooms, even the libraries I relied on no longer exist. I now work wherever I find a safe corner, often with intermittent internet and electricity, trying to maintain connections with students scattered across Gaza. What is missing? What we mourn is not only buildings or equipment, but the very institutions that give knowledge its home, the spaces for inquiry, debate, and growth that define Palestinian higher education. More than 190 academic staff in Gaza, including professors, lecturers, researchers, have been killed. At the center of this devastation are 87,000 students whose education and futures have been violently disrupted. I want to share a photo with you. This photo was taken during the orientation session for new students in September 2023. As you can see, young men and women, full of hope, eager to begin a new chapter of their lives, dreaming of a better future. But even in that moment, their ambitions existed within the constraints of a long-standing siege and occupation that has for years limited the possibilities of education in Gaza. The classrooms, libraries, and campuses they entered were already under pressure from chronic deprivation, intermittent electricity, and restricted access to resources. Then, just weeks later, the same spaces were reduced to rubble by bombardment. The optimism captured in that first photo was abruptly replaced by fear, loss, and destruction. The contrast here shows both the continuity of harm and the unprecedented scale of the current destruction of higher education in Gaza, reminding us how fragile education is under conditions of classicide and occupation. This September, a month that once meant hope and a new school year, classrooms in Gaza remain destroyed, desks empty. More than 650,000 students are being denied education, with 97% of schools damaged, including 432 schools directly struck. Many schools now serve as overcrowded shelters for displaced people in Gaza. although many of them have been struck. Since this war began on October 7, 2023, at least 17,175 students, mostly primary and secondary, have been killed. To put this in perspective, imagine filling London's O2 Arena or the new Oxford United Stadium with students, each seat occupied by a child whose future was abruptly ended, who was killed. Faculty in Gaza attempt to teach while enduring the same trauma, instability, and shortages as students. Electricity and internet are intermittent at best, yet teaching and learning persist. Students continue to show up, sometimes in partially damaged buildings or converted shelters, connecting via slow or unstable internet, sending assignments whenever they can, and joining online classes despite frequent disruptions. Faculty persist in reaching them, recording lessons on phones, making calls, and sharing materials through WhatsApp or other messaging apps, doing everything possible to ensure that learning continues. Educators in Gaza and students as well have had to reinvent learning. We improvise and adapt in ways no policy or framework anticipates. When video conferencing fails, we teach through low bandwidth tools. When connection drops, we break lessons into very short voice messages. And students share notes, form study groups in shelters, and tutor each other when teachers cannot connect. This resilience, what we Palestinians call sumud, the steadfast determination to endure and resist harsh conditions, is especially evident today. But it is not new. It has long defined higher education in Palestine, where learning has persisted despite blockade and repeated assaults. But let's be clear. Academic life under siege and occupation is not just difficult. It is precarious. Just days ago, I had to cancel an interview with an international TV channel because a building facing the internet cafe, I am currently there, and I work from here, this building received an evacuation order, meaning that it will be targeted, it will be bombarded. And students, I assume, do the same. They move between temporary shelters, seeking quiet corners to study. Teachers deliver lessons while listening for drones overhead, worried for their families. Classrooms, books, technology, and safety cannot be taken for granted. Sometimes the scale of this destruction makes me wonder whether even the term scholasticide fully captures what is happening here in Gaza. Academic freedom cannot be separated from material conditions. So the right to speak, publish, and inquire depends on electricity, buildings, connectivity, and safety. And without these, academic freedom becomes really abstract and disconnected from reality. Today, as I speak to you from Gaza, really over 86% of the Gaza Strip falls within the Israeli militarized zone, which means residents are forced to evacuate and move into the densely populated areas marked here in white and gray. So the areas in red or orange are areas where there are no residents. The areas in white and gray are the areas where people are still there here in Gaza City and in the south. Just a couple of days ago, when evacuation leaflets were dropped over Gaza City, my family of 30 had to make really urgent decisions overnight. What to take, where to go, and how to keep everyone safe, which is impossible. Living through this and striving to keep learning going for my students amid the chaos, I have witnessed firsthand how education continues even under extreme and immediate threat. And right here is where I'm addressing you from the city center of Gaza, from the heart of Gaza City. And honestly, this map was updated in July. I'm talking to you in September. And some of these areas in white and gray are no longer populated. So people are already moving south from here to here. And it seems likely that my family and I will be forced to leave not too far from today. Something that we do not want, something that we do not just accept. The practices I've just mentioned are not unique to Gaza. Across the world, in refugee camps, in Lebanon and Jordan, in flood-affected areas of South Asia, educators and students improvise to sustain learning. Education policies in crisis settings must recognize local practices and locally defined priorities, engage with them, elevate them, and build on them. The Emergency Committee of Universities in Gaza has repeatedly called for support, and there are concrete ways education institutions and academics around the world can make a difference. From my experience, the most meaningful support comes from creating opportunities that sustain learning and scholarly collaboration, like initiating virtual fellowships, including Gazan academics as co-investigators on grant projects, providing access to online resources, and offering mentorship or collaborative research projects. These actions help ensure that education in Gaza continues. International responses often stop at technical fixes like online platforms and providing emergency funds and support. These really help, but they are not enough. What Gaza needs is sustained solidarity, partnerships that really last, advocacy that protects education under attack, and investment in people, not just buildings. This means embedding Gaza academics as equal partners in research, creating long-term collaborations, and guaranteeing students uninterrupted access to learning, even when universities are destroyed. So international responses are expected to address deeper questions of justice, equity, and survival. Who has electricity to power the devices? Who has internet to join the platform? Who is safe enough to study? And these questions are key. What Gaza shows us is that technology can only support learning when the material and ethical conditions are in place. Conditions that have been systematically undermined here by the destructions of schools and universities, the targeting of scholars, and the erasure of knowledge. These patterns are not unique to Palestine. They extend globally through arms investments, colonial partnerships, and suppression of student solidarity, normalizing inequalities. Reimagining education policy in crisis contexts requires confronting these realities directly. Education institutions must build genuine partnerships with Palestinian universities through scholarships and programs. They must teach Palestine's history. So what does this mean for education policy? First, education is not only about service delivery. As Emma said, it is about survival, dignity, and future making. Second, students and teachers are active agents of creativity, not passive recipients of aid. Third, policies must foreground the realities of crisis, the vulnerability of learners, the materials conditions of learning, and the ethical imperative to support education as a right, not as a privilege. When classrooms are destroyed, the very foundation that support inquiry and critical thinking crumble as well. Yet when students and educators continue to teach under siege and occupation, they remind us that education is more than walls and textbooks. It is dignity and resistance. It is the insistence on a future that refuses to be erased. As we gather here at UKFIET to reflect on global education, I urge us all to carry this lesson forward. Policies must go beyond technical fixes and address the deeper questions of justice, equity, and humanity. Education in crisis is not about continuity of service. It is about affirming the right to learn as an act of hope. I would like to end with this message. We honestly cannot rebuild Gaza's universities with bricks and concrete alone. What we need are ideas, networks, and solidarities strong enough to carry knowledge through the rubble. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ahmed, Jamal, Junina. It was an extremely moving and powerful speech. I would like to welcome everyone to the UKFIET conference this year as the chair of UKFIET Executive. On behalf of the executive organizers, trustees, welcome everyone. We are extremely grateful for Professor Junina's presence today. We are delighted that you could join us live and you can stay with us to the end so that we can take questions and answers. We have a little bit of exchange between two speakers following the second talk. We are especially grateful that you could deliver this talk under such extraordinarily difficult, brutal circumstances. Thank you so much. Our theme this year, Mobilizing Knowledge, Partnerships and Innovations for Sustainable Development through Education and Training, asks us to think about how knowledge moves across communities and contexts, how education might be reimagined to serve peace, equity, inclusion, sustainability. The two keynote speakers that we have invited to this opening session approach this question from distinct but deeply interconnected vantage points. Professor Yusuf joins us now to offer a keynote that speaks directly to the heart of this year's theme. Professor Said is the Professorial Chair of Global Education Policy and Equity in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Sussex and an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town. He has worked across academic, government, and multilateral settings as a scholar, policy specialist, and education rights advocate. His earlier posts include the South African chair in teacher education, the founding director of the Center for International Teacher Education at Cape Town Peninsula University of Technology, and senior policy positions at UNESCO and the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Professor Said's research focuses on the relationship between the development and implementation of policy within education systems and its implications for equity and social justice. His work spans over 40 countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Through a body of scholarship grounded in comparative, interdisciplinary, and critical perspectives, Professor Said has examined how education policies take shape, how they are implemented, and why their stated aims, particularly in relation to equity, inclusion, and social justice, are so often compromised in practice. He has written extensively on teacher education, education governance, public-private partnerships, and the legacies of colonialism. His current work examines global education policy, equitable partnerships, education decolonization, teacher professionalism and development, and climate justice in and through education. This morning, Professor Said will speak on a field in crisis, reimagining education policy for challenging times. It is a call to think critically and collectively and very carefully about how we respond through policy, research, and action to the complex pressures that shape education today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Said.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you for the organizers of UKFIET and Ahmed, who I can blame for inviting me to do the keynote. But I'm so pleased to be following Ahmed rather than opening, because I think what Ahmed has given us is a very powerful testament to the title we both share, Field in Crisis. And I think we share this title, Ahmed and I, because the field in crisis is in two ways in crisis. One, it's in crisis with the ground realities we are witnessing today, what Ahmed very powerfully talks about. And we also share the title because the crisis we see on the ground, in whichever country we're looking at, calls on us to rethink what is it that we research, for whom are we researching it, and why are we researching, and more importantly, what do we do with that which we research? So it calls on us to think about who we are, and when I say who we are, I mean the broad who we are and what we do. And I'm going to start off by building on what Ahmed says and contextualize it by saying that what has been powerfully described in Gaza and Palestine today, we witness in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, and other parts of the world. But they're not only contemporary, because today, at this present conjuncture, we are historically positioned within almost 30 years of the genocide of Srebrenica, almost 15 years or more, or 10 years or more of the South African Fees Must Fall movement and the call for decolonization. And we witnessed the unfortunate anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've also witnessed, in other words, what we're seeing is a long history of how global histories of dispossession, state violence, and resistance are deeply entangled. And I think it's important to position the conversation and the conference in a larger history. But I'm going to, in the next slide, start with hopefully I get that right. Okay, this one, okay. In the next slide, I'm going to start with data we picked up on a report done by the Real CLS and UNRWA. It's data that updates the report in 2024, and the title of this report that's forthcoming is that education in Palestine is still under continued attack. And the data is, to use the pun intended in the language of policy speak, it is a killer fact in different ways. Because in the address at the UN General Assembly. Catherine Russell used this for the director of UNICEF said, over the past 21 months of war, more than 17,000 children have reportedly been killed and 33,000 injured in Gaza. The other way to think about it, an average of 28 children have been killed each day, the equivalent of an entire classroom. Consider that for a moment, a whole classroom of children killed every day for nearly 2 years. I mean, I think if we just pause for a while to reflect on, it puts very powerfully in perspective a conference that talks about knowledge mobilization and in whose interest we are acting. And that data is at one level something we're witnessing, but to put it in a different context, it's not like we don't know. It's a graphic reminder that is sometimes impossible to bear. But that classroom of children being killed is also echoed in Sudan, Yemen, and elsewhere. And it extends beyond conflict zones into contexts where children are denied the right to education, which may not take their lives physically, but in every other way extinguishes dreams, aspirations, hopes, and possible futures. The killing is both physical, and in every other way, it's also killing as well. And that's some of the data. So that brings me to discuss the theme of the conference, which is about unpacking some of the real-world consequences of education policy choices and the structural context in which we make them. It brings into very sharp relief the role of a scholarly community and in gatherings such as UKFIET, and not only UKFIET, whose theme focuses on mobilizing knowledge, partnerships and innovations for sustainable development through education and training. In this context, I've outlined such a theme must ask certain critical questions. Whose knowledge are we mobilizing? What kind of partnerships are we talking about? What is the ethical and principal foundations of the partnerships we're trying to work towards? And innovations, what kind of innovations do we want? For what purposes? In a field concerned with international education. The emphasis on mobilizing in this year's themes resonates with action and focus on practice, so pertinent to the context shape above. So how should we think about it? So in the longer version of the paper, and I'm not going to go through the whole paper, I'll give you the synoptic overview and spend a lot more time in the second and third part. The starting point of the paper is to argue that inequality is fundamentally the driving force of all the global challenges addressed in the paper, and should, as the Sustainable Development Goals acknowledge, be key to the broad development framework. For me, poverty elimination or eradicating extreme poverty is important, and the goals talk about it, but fundamentally it's inequality. Poverty is simply the unacceptable face of inequality, to quote Tony on social policy. In other words, the problem is inequality, not poverty. And if we think about inequality, we think about those in positions of privilege, the colonizers, the occupiers, and the wealthy, as I'll begin to show later. In other words, the brave thing to do is the Sustainable Development Goals should not commit itself to reducing and mitigating inequities, but about eradicating inequalities. Because inequalities only exist, or poverties only exist because some people are rich and the remainder are poor or marginalized. The privileged only maintain the privilege at the expense of those who are not privileged. The colonizers and the possessors only maintain their colonization and possession at the expense of dispossession. So I think that's the fundamental problem. So in this paper, but not in this talk, I'll outline the framework which I just spoke about. In the second moment and movement of the talk, I will highlight 3 pressing global challenges in education: the emerging rise of populism and authoritarian populism, climate and environmental degradation with the urgent need for climate justice, and lastly, protracted conflict, and which manifest in cuts to global aid. I will talk about these three challenges as polycrisis, and in policy terms are intractable wicked policy problems. Finally, I will consider the implications of these interrelated challenges for how we understand the purpose, content, delivery, and outcomes of education. In the third movement of the talk, I will try to link it to what I call the new global pedagogy reforms. And everybody in this room will talk about them across the next 3 days. Whether you will be talking about teaching at the right level, scripted lesson planning, foundation literacy and numeracy, and I can go on and on. I'll be talking about that, and I'll be trying to show how they connect, if they connect, to the global challenges. How do those global pedagogy reforms address the fundamental existential challenges we are facing, or how should they do that? And in the final part of the talk, where I'll spend a lot of time for today, I will share the relevance of this talk and these priorities and look at the possibilities and constraints. In other words, I will conclude by exploring the implications for scholarship, policy, and practice in the field. But the intention is not to offer another set of prescriptions. I think we have far too many global prescriptions, but to highlight approaches that may foster critical dialogue and debate, both during this conference and beyond. The conclusions does not seek closure, but instead aims to animate dialogue. To paraphrase Gramsci, in a time of monsters and an interregnum, where the new world struggles to emerge from the old brutal world, disruptive and dangerous dialogue offers hope for the future. So that gives you the synoptic overview. That's the whole argument. Now I'll go quickly through the rest of the talk. So let's talk about the three interconnected global challenges I'm talking about. I think when I was preparing for this talk and looking at the data, I was quite alarmed by the erosions of the global goods that we all talk about. These global goods are water, environment, etc., and life. And while arguably you could argue that there are many global challenges, for me it is conflict, environment, which is linked to and shaped by how arguably authoritarian populist governments respond to this challenge, that has one of the most significant impacts on access to equitable and quality learning for all. These challenges constrain equitable education, but also at the same time, equitable access to quality education is key to resolving. It's the duality of education that I will focus on. I focus on these three, and there could be others, because education is both a driver as well as a solution to some of these challenges. And I think some of the debates focus far more on the solution sometimes at the expense of looking at how these three challenges are both the drivers. And I think what those challenges are challenging us is to think of a post-war social welfare systems and the ideas of Westphalian democracy, which people would argue is very much going to bed, but the world is also increasingly becoming polarized, more violent, less able to agree on global common goods such as the environment. As a result, and as I'll talk later, the very principles of multilateralism and collective action that is needed for dealing with these challenges of the global good are in jeopardy. Perhaps some would argue in the throes of a long, agonizing demise. So, with that, let me just talk about these three challenges: conflict, war, and displacement, populism, and environment. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that the rise of populist authoritarianism globally, alongside war, conflicts, and displacement, has been striking. It's not been recent, it's been some time in the making, and it has and in the paper I talk a lot more about it. But fundamentally, the way populist authoritarianism is manifesting in education is that currently it's actively undermining discussions of the legacies of slavery, dispossession, and colonialism. It's displacing and undermining discussions of critical race theory and programs of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or else, in dangerous ways, co-opting those very discourses. And I think various commentators, and I won't talk about that much, Fazil Rizvi, Marie Lal, and others, using India as an example of populism, has shown how authoritarian populist governments or populist governments can co-opt the very discourses of decolonization or, for example, other things in order for narrow chauvinistic nationalism. What we're seeing is, and it also acts against, it projects a very particular national imagery and a particular conception of citizenship in and through education that is visible in ugly incidents at universities, and I'm quoting, and in particular in the curriculum that argues certain things cannot be taken. So while the nature, form, content, and strategic approaches may vary across nation states, there is an underlying policy ideational mix of populism which projects a particular form of citizenship and ideas. And this is also the case in climate justice. When we think about, I'm going to first talk about conflict, war, and displacement. And there are four things I want to talk about conflict, war, and displacement in relation to education. First, conflicts, war, and displacements against peoples and civilians have not been purely military. Many have been about the erasures of all forms of education, leading to a whole generation of children, young people, adults without any identity. War has been about erasure, and not the destruction of physical infrastructure is important, but fundamentally that's about erasure of being, identity, and the resistance is about the resistance to erasure, which is why in wars archives get bombed, documentary data gets bombed to deny people their histories and to deny the assertive assertions to identities. But it also has produced, as in the case of Palestine, an unfortunate lexicon of words. We now talk about ecocide, scholasticide, educide, healthocide, urbanicide, every kind of way. But what I think those words represent in conflict context, but generally even in non-conflict context, is the deliberate targeting of social sector provision and the totality of erasure in education and in society as a whole. Secondly, the international destruction of educational facilities is not only contrary to international law, but it's also about denying a repository of knowledge and memory of the oppressed in colonial context. And that's quite crucial to how histories of colonization surface themselves. Third, wars and conflicts have been characterized by an increase in gender-based violence. Using young girls and women, for example, have been particularly incredibly subjected to different forms of violence. Fourth, and I'll come to this later now, is the increased weaponization of aid. When we think about climate justice through the lens of inequality, social justice, and policy, we often think about climate justice in a different way because we think about what gets muted in conversations about education and climate justice. A lot of the discourse about education for sustainable development talks about teaching people to mitigate the effects on education, but it doesn't ask fundamentally who is responsible for the environment, who should bear the cost, and who carries the most burden of it. Understandably, we have to address this problem as a set of global goods that requires collective action, but this should not come at the expense of understanding clearly who is responsible, and therefore who should carry the most cost in mitigating the climate crisis. If we have to pay a price for reaching agreement on the climate in and through education, then the price must not be at the expense of those who are least responsible for the climate crisis. So put differently, curricula about education for sustainable development should not talk only about the cognitive science of it, but should also directly focus on the responsibilities of wealthy individuals and countries for mitigating climate. This means that we need to look at the curriculum of UK, for example, US, every other country, and see how they deal with climate and climate education in terms of their interconnected histories of global domination and colonization. Climate justice in and through education is not just about individual action, important as that may be, but it's also about understanding the structural context that drives climate degradation. The graphs that I'll show now simply makes that point, and I won't talk later. It just tells you in a captured way who's responsible for the climate, but yet who faces the greatest disproportionate. But these crises are intersecting and poly. And one way of representing the intersecting nature of this climate is in this graph. Wars have created far more carbon emission. And I think this graph speaks for itself. It shows how wars in the Middle East are probably one of the largest emitters of carbon emission in the last while. And one single agent is responsible for bulk of this climate emissions. It's 1.8 trillion. I've got the data in the longer version of the paper. But there's also another way in which climate justice intersects with populism. The popular radical right constituencies also express deep skepticism, as in the case of the data I cite in the paper in Brazil, towards climate priorities, creating fertile grounds for leaders to dismantle environmental regimes, reinforcing a structural nexus, and I'm quoting, between populist governance and ecological degradation, and displacing from the curriculum climate science in favor of climate denialism. So populism, climate justice are interconnected. So what I've tried to do is briefly sketch out the three challenges. I will very briefly just talk about how has this impacted the curriculum, and I've given you some clues about that. How has this impacted aid, and how has this impacted the international architecture, specifically the idea of multilateralism? I'm not going to go through the curriculum because I spoke about it, but I was going to flag three impacts of these challenges on aid. First, there has been a direct cutbacks in aid, and I think that's everybody's familiar with. But I think what's more important is not simply the backsliding on aid, the cutbacks on aid, is the displacement of aid in favor of military expenditure. Militarization has become far more important. So the cutback of aid to 3%, for example, in the UK, is accompanied by an increase in military expenditure to 5% as a commitment over time. And most countries in the global north are moving towards that. So in 2024, and I quote, global military expenditure reached 3.7 trillion. The same year, just to give you it differently, the UN's annual budget was 3.72 billion, which is a small fraction of the spending on military. So what you're seeing is the way in which the military expenditure is overshadowing spending on developed UN, for example. To put it another way, if you look at the Global Education Monitoring Report financing gap, and there may be debates about how accurate it is, nonetheless, the military expenditure is just a fraction of it. So to put it another way is to say that if you reprioritize military expenditure in favor of education, that would be far more significant. But not only that, in the current context of aid, we must not only talk about the cutbacks of aid, we must also talk about the discussion of reparations and colonial legacies. The African Union has devoted its 2025 theme to justice for Africans and for peoples of African descent through reparations, describing this initiative in the following way. This initiative underscores the AU commitment to addressing historical injustices, including the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide. It builds on decades of advocacy and collaboration, aiming to foster unity and establish mechanisms for reparatory justice on a global scale. So it's not just about cutting of aid, it's about aid is not charity. Aid is about the long histories of colonization, which is why I'm quite pleased to read in the newspaper this weekend The AU is throwing its weight behind the Pan-African Higher Education Reparations Fund. I think that's something we need to debate, and I think it's not just for Pan-Africa, it's the Pan-Global South Higher Education Reparation Funds. Gaza doesn't need charity, or Palestine doesn't need charity, it needs reparations, and it needs an address of colonization. So, and in this sense, in the paper I quote, and in the next slide, I show a quote from We Are Not Numbers, because I think this captures the point about what I'm saying far better than I could. Do you think a child who walks in the street while a drone carrying rockets over her head wants or even needs hands out of food and clothing, what you call humanitarian aid? And the poem continues in that same vein and ends thusly, as Ahmed has said, what they want, what they need is true for all of us: dignity, independence, and freedom. So reparations as part of restoring dignity, independence, and freedom is what is required. Third, the contemporary global challenges have weakened multilateralism, both as a framework for addressing collective global problems such as climate in education, but also weakened the grounds under which we can foster mutual understanding and tolerance, which are crucial to learning to live together. This unraveling, this demise of multilateralism does not augur well for COP30 that's coming up, and for any other framework that's going to be debated in the next 5 years, such as the post-SDG agenda. And in fact, it's linked to populism to the extent that the US State Department said this: UNESCO works to advance divisive social and cultural causes and maintains an outsized focus on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, a globalist ideological agenda for international development at odds with our America's First policy, a State Department spokes. And it's not for the first time, it's probably for the fifth or more time that the US yet withdrew again from UNESCO. So what you're seeing is the rise of nationalist agendas pulling away from multilateralism, which is problematic. But there's another side to the multilateralism, is that on the one hand, what it does is it can weaken the conditions for collective action, which is fundamental to addressing collective goods. And talking about the research again of education still under continued attack, how do you, and I quote here, how can we teach young children in Gaza about democracy and human rights when they see a world that has failed to protect such rights, and then they find that there is no adherence to international human rights? So what you're seeing is an unraveling of multilateralism, not just by actions, but by the realities of what people have. So the idea of education for sustainable development, or target 4.7 of the SDGs, is meaningless in a context for many people who can't see its value or its purchase. Yet at the same time, what you're seeing is, some would argue, a more positive development within the international education aid system, or aid system more generally. The growing rise of multipolarity opposed to a single multilateral approaches in addressing common global problems. Multipolarity at one level has a long history, dating back to the non-aligned movement in the UN in the 50s and 60s, for example, which emerged from the Bandung Conference. Having strong alternative polarities does not necessarily, I argue, undermine multilateralism, but it does challenge our thinking about whether and how multilateralism may be the way to solve or work with these polarities in addressing common education problems. Now, reflecting on his time as the UN Secretary General, Martin Griffiths, this is another anniversary to think about. The UN approaches its 40th anniversary in September. It's structurally problematic. It has intense fracturing, funding shortfalls, arguably increasing irrelevance. But what is lost, and I think I want to quote Griffiths here because I think he's right. He says, it's lost its courage. It's lost its courage to act and to intervene decisively. And I guess if I extend that in a context of a conference on education partnership, We can talk about academic courage in teaching, scholarship, research partnerships, and the association reform. We need a value-driven, principle and academically informed courage to guide how we respond. In this part, I'll talk a little bit about these global policy reforms, but I'm not going to go through the details of them, but I want to just connect the global pedagogy reforms to the crisis that I spoke about. If you look at the environment and these global pedagogic reforms, you see an immediate disconnect. And here I quote a UNESCO report on getting every school climate ready. How countries are integrating climate change issues in education. Two facts of this report are sobering. This is what the report says. Currently, the countries most likely to include climate change content are those in regions most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as opposed to those largely responsible for the emissions causing climate change. So those who are most affected take on climate education, and those who are responsible take on least. And it goes on further to say that teachers feel comfortable with the cognitive dimensions of climate change, not surprisingly when you measure that, but feel very uncomfortable about explaining well how to take actions. So the values of the teachers and the agency of the teachers to work on how to take action on climate is significant. This is a way for me just to show you how intersectionality, the pedagogic reforms, and the crisis I have. I'm not going to go through in detail. I'm sure people in this room are more familiar and comfortable with this scripted lesson planning, scripted pedagogy, teaching at the right level, foundational numeracy and literacy, scripted professional development, middle tier governance. Now, I'm just going to spell out three implications of this. First, the question is, it's not like this wasn't known. Any good teacher would know that if you're targeted, your teaching should be targeted at the right level. Clearly, any teacher knows that you should focus on the foundations when you teach. Clearly, any teacher does know that you have effective governance structures at the middle tier. At the schools or district to support you, your work is so much better. And if you have access to good quality professional development, it makes sense. The question is, why has this come around in this current phase, and why has it been advocated particularly by internationals? And a nod to my colleague Kwame, why is it becoming the best buys of the Global Education Advisory Panel reports? And we're sponsoring some of these kinds of things. Now, I think we can talk about this in more detail, but I want to just flag a few things about this, and then I'll move on to it. I'm going to flag three things about it. One, they what I call the pedagogic common sense. And I think in the latter part of the paper, I'll say they're a bit like how child-centered education emerged in the 1980s, like the common sense, right? This is all what we know. The question is, what does it exclude when we think about it? Well, one of the things it excludes, and one of the ways in which emerges in the current context, is by the invocation and language of crisis. And this language of crisis primarily speaks about the learning crisis, citing outcome assessment results, primarily in literacy and numeracy. In so doing, I argue this new set of pedagogic reforms seek to create a particular policy imaginary about education and the role of teachers. In one respect, it involves establishing practices, regulations, and frameworks as tools to discipline and surveil the work of teachers while narrowing what is considered valuable for learners to learn. Because what gets driven out of that is the very challenges that I spoke about in the earlier part. How do you engage with populism? How do you engage with climate degradation? How do you engage with colonization? How do you engage with those? So in that sense, I think the learning crisis is important, learning poverty is important, but I think we should stop talking about it. And I can spend a few minutes talking. We should rather talk about learning inequality, because that's a far better measure of the relationship between the rich and poor in terms of who learns and who doesn't learn, but also brings into measure of what people learn, as opposed to learning poverty, which tends to focus on learning crisis which tends to focus on the disadvantaged or marginalized rather than the other part of the equation who are the rich. So these concepts of crisis and poverty, while I'm not arguing these reforms are bad, let me just be clear, in the longer paper I go into great detail of why they're good, but in the shorter version that I'm delivering, the talking version of the paper, while they positively focus on learning, they often are used, as Klein and Roy suggest, an opportunity and portal to create a particular pedagogic framework and approach. And I'll save that for the next part, which is the last part. So in about 10 minutes, if you can indulge me, I'll talk in 10 minutes about the next slide. What I want to talk about is the politics of possibilities and how do we move beyond the barbarism that we see. So I've traversed in a synoptic way the broader global context in which the field of international education and development is operating, as well as consider the new pedagogical reforms animating educational thought. In traversing this landscape, the intention has been to highlight the implications for education, specifically for teachers and learning. And most people who know me won't be surprised that I'm going to talk a lot more about teachers now, right? So, health warning, you can focus on the slide and zone out when I talk about teachers. In the time remaining, I will talk about teachers. But what I want to talk about is about the policies of possibilities. And again, borrowing a term from Gramsci, where he talks about the new world struggles to be born. And we're now confronting the monsters. My question is, in this era of monsters, what should our field be doing, myself included, and how do we respond to the policy crises that have also thrown it into crisis? And I'm arguing that the monsters we face are not merely people, they're also nations, they're ideas, and they are the policy imaginaries and choices we make. The battles we are confronting are as much against ideas and practices as they are against tangible actors in a time of barbarism. But this interregnum, as Gramsci would also say, is also a moment in which we can and should help shape a more positive and socially just futures. How do we measure up in this forum? And I'm going to take a detour because I looked at UKFIET over the last 18 UKFIETs, and I went through the archives, and look, it's a very quick rendition. I went from, I'm excluding the Oxford conferences before they became UKFIET. So those who've been here far longer than me, and I haven't been to UKFIET for a long time, there were Oxford conferences, but one of the main UKFIET conferences was in 1989. It was also a time of great global change. It was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And kind of almost 18 or more UKFIETs later, we also had a time of great global shifts and change. And we're asking those very questions that were asked. But what is interesting when you do a synoptic overview of the themes of the UKFIET, there seems to be a shift over time from a strong focus in state and what the states do and the value of international development as a force of good to becoming more critical. And partnerships become more discussed as the themes evolve. But some things become more powerful, but only recently become more prominent. For example, centering the global south becomes far more significant in later UKFIETs. Decolonization appears much later in the language of UKFIET as well. And so the question then becomes, as UKFIET move forward, its conferences must grapple with these tensions while centering the voices of those most affected by educational inequalities. Progress is evident, yet the challenge remains of how to advance with the urgency demanded of the context that I discussed earlier. So where do we start thinking about it? And here I'm going to give you a few starting points. They're not prescription. For me, an important starting point is a normative commitment to social justice in a context of fear and both direct and indirect repression. As I said earlier, the courage to speak. It's to paraphrase Paulo Freire's, reading the world means to change the world that we inhabit. The value of education as a democratic enterprise lies not in deconstructing the world as it is, but also crucially in its future orientation, where educators, learners, and all participants engage in imagining a different, more equal future. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I'm going to focus on teacher agency, because part of the global pedagogic reforms have extended the whole debate about what we think about teachers and teacher agency. In the long version of the paper, I outline the conception of teacher agency that I work with, but in the shorter version, the one that I'm delivering now, I will talk about, just return to some brief premises about how we think about teachers. There's a global growing recognition that teachers are important and that after home backgrounds, teachers make a significant impact on learning. That's obvious. I've often said in other talks, it's taken the global community a long time to figure out what any teacher knew from the very start, that they make a difference to learning. The global attention to teachers is not disconnected from the growing realization, albeit quite slow, about the centrality of teachers as agents of change. The research I have undertaken has sought to unpack two elements of this claim. The first is what people mean when they talk about the agency of teachers, and the second is the kind of agency. So I'm going to talk on the second part because I know I'm running out of time. The kind of agency I'm talking about is more than subject expertise, and it's more about assuming that teachers can do everything in the classroom. The ever-expanding remit of teachers is something we need to be careful about, piling on climate change and piling on foundational literacy and numeracy, piling on everything else. If you're a teacher, you just can't manage it. So what kind of agency are we talking about in education policy? We're talking about teachers being very clear and normative in their approach. Teachers help learners read the world to change the world. Their role extends to supporting learners in changing the world, including in history and science. Teachers therefore act through transgression and disruption. So the argument I'm making is teachers as transgressive and disruptive agencies. In other words, it requires education and policy frameworks that empower teachers to think of teaching not as a neutral technical activity. It's not about climate science only. It's also about what causes climate degradation. And it's also about talking about teachers and their political standpoint and their political agents. And what I talk about here is the extent to which teachers work with other collective actors, and fundamentally about how teachers work in global solidarity. And I'm going to quote here two things of the report, and I think Ahmed spoke about it. Teachers also are part of resistance. They resist education in all sorts of ways. Ahmed spoke about in Palestine, but I want to quote from the latest Teacher Summit, where the Deputy General Secretary of the UN said this: "Today in Gaza, UNRWA teachers have been killed while trying to educate children. And this is also the case in Sudan. Teachers huddle with students as violence creeps closer and closer in Ukraine. Educators conduct lessons in bomb shelters and basements across dozens of conflict zones worldwide. Schools lie in rubble while teachers risk everything to keep learning alive. These educators express agency in the way they teach. Simply teaching is a form of resistance, and simply teaching against colonialism and oppression is the action." So what I'm going to argue that teachers can be both an oppressor and a liberator, and so can academics and researchers. I'm arguing for advocating for teachers who supports learners not only to understand the world, but give them the skills and competencies to change it. Such a teacher is not a neutral or technical agent, but who stands on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized. In his book, The Politics of Education, for blog we're writing, Paulo Freire admonishes, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful. Not to be neutral is not an option. He goes on and later on. And this also extends to association. So what can we do? How do we navigate hope and despair? And this I struggle with all the time in the last two slides. What can be done? How do we navigate? Well, you know, I read this very interesting article and piece in The Guardian as well by the ex-Greek finance minister, who said that he met a person at one of his talks who asked him, how do we navigate between hope and despair? And she said she wasn't frustrated because we didn't know, but she was frustrated with those who knew not acting. And I think that's a very powerful message that comes out, right? It's about the capacity to act for good to actually doing so. It's the capacity to know and not to act is the challenge that we have. And I guess in conducting interviews for the education under still continued attack in Palestine, I experienced a great sense of despair and hopelessness by everybody I spoke to, because much of what people spoke about is known. Everybody I met this morning who I was speaking about was saying, we know it, but how do we make sense of it? Why we are frustrated enough to not even be able to hear the news daily, because every time the news. So how do we move from that? So it made me reflect on what does it mean to research around these global challenges framed within an inequitable and oppressive. And I don't have answers, but I have several questions. Are we meant to be angry? Is anger compatible with being dispassionate? Is anger a permanent state of the research that people do? This is the questions I think we have to confront over the next few days. When do we stop feeling angry, and should we stop feeling angry? And in a sense, I'm going to quote Cornel West, who said that, he wasn't quoting about teachers, but I paraphrase his work. He says, justice is about acting out, and love we express is justice in public, right? And I'm distorting slightly his quote, but I think it makes the point that I want to make. So, in ending, I will end with two quotes, again, from one react numbers. This was a reflection of a poem of 24. It says, thank you 2024 for making me homesick in my own land within myself. Thank you for forcing me to question everything. And then it goes on in detail. I demand justice for you. I demand justice for my younger sister, for my disabled Sita Rahma. I demand justice for the laughter I had to force from myself. But it ends with an important part, and this is what we need to do. Because you, 2024, may leave, 2025 may also leave, but I will not forget. And I think that's a clarion call to action. And so my final point is that in addressing contemporary global challenges, and the important thing, this conference, we need to do so within a framework that does not inevitably reproduce the very powers, structures, and assumptions that contribute to inequities. And let me leave the final word to Arfa Mahdawi, who's talking about, please don't succumb to hopelessness over Palestine. Your voice can still make a difference. She said, it's hard to stay hopeful in today's monstrous time, notes the reference to Gramsci, but for the sake of people bearing the brunt of modern monstrosity, it is important that we do. Ask yourself this way, if you're in Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc., watching your babies wither away from engineered starvation, would you want someone to speak up for you? I think it's a question I'm struggling with, and I think we all need to ask ourselves that question over the next few days and as we do our academic work in different ways or our policy work. So thank you, and I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Said, for the powerful address. Now we will open the floor to questions and reflections. I would like, Emma will now find out if we can bring back Ahmed. Maybe he was online. Hopefully he was online throughout the talk. Oh, great. Lovely to see you back, Ahmed. Hello. Hopefully you were able to listen to the second talk. Great, that's great. So as we open the floor to reflections and questions, I would like to ask Ahmed and Yusuf, if it's possible, as you address those reflections and questions, please, if you have a chance, also reflect on each other's talks. I know you wanted to reflect on each other's talks, but since we have limited time now to take questions, I would like to mix the two, if that's possible, hopefully. Okay, so please raise your hand if you want to share a brief reflection or to ask a question. Please keep your intervention brief so that we listen to as many people as possible. And please state very briefly your name and basically institutional affiliation. Please. The gentleman there, if we can take the question, and afterwards.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, speak up. Please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Zainul Abidin. I'm from University of Glasgow. First of all, thank you so much. That was such a powerful